Hey everybody, I hope you're well. It's another day, another case, and today we're going to be talking about Barron v. the City of Baltimore. And we're just going to hop right on into this particular case. So, in this instance, there was a pier, and the pier was owned by Craig and Barron. Now, Barron is the plaintiff in this particular case, and the pier was in Baltimore, Maryland. Now, this particular pier in the case is described as highly productive on the eastern side of the city. Now, the city, in the exercise of its power and jurisdiction, engaged in certain behaviors, things like paving the roads, maintaining the general health of Baltimore, but in this instance, it was their decision to divert water from some of the hills outside of the city into the city that causes the issue. Because if you've never been to the East Coast, particularly the Washington, D.C., Baltimore area, it rains a lot. And it tends to rain a lot in a very short amount of time. And both Baltimore and the surrounding areas are fairly low-lying by the waterside. So in this particular case, the rain came, the streams all overflowed, and with that overflow came a bunch of dirt, debris, and sediment from those hills now into the wharf. If you've ever seen a wharf and understand kind of how they work, they have to be deep enough that boats and ships can get up to them. And all of that dirt, all of that sediment, when it got to the wharf, shallowed the water. And as a result, the wharf was now no longer highly productive. In fact, the wharf ended up basically being useless. In filing suit, Barron alleged a series of injuries over a span of time from about 1815 to 1821, in which this sediment buildup and this injury got worse and worse and worse over time, and was continuing to do so in 1822 when he filed this particular lawsuit. Now, Baltimore City made the argument that they had the right to redirect the water from the hills to the city because of the city charter itself from the Maryland legislature. So they had been given that power by the state of Maryland to do so. Barron, on the other hand, argued a Fifth Amendment federal constitution claim, basically saying that you have taken my property through this action and you've done so without just compensation. At the original trial, the court actually found against Baltimore and for Barron and gave him damages to the tune of $4,500. However, on appeal, this was actually reversed, and then we end up at the Supreme Court on a writ of error. Now, as I mentioned, Barron was making a Fifth Amendment federal argument here, basically saying that as an American citizen, the protections of the federal Constitution travel with me always, and it's up to the government to provide those protections regardless of who is doing the violating, whether it's the federal government or the state government. The Supreme Court in this case found that they would have to make the determination whether or not they could apply the federal Constitution against the states themselves. Now, mind you, this is in the early part of the 19th century. The 14th Amendment doesn't exist yet. And so this Supreme Court found that if they cannot apply the federal Constitution against the states, then there's actually no action here, and this case would have to be dismissed due to a lack of jurisdiction. And unfortunately for Barron, that's actually exactly what they found. The court started out by basically making the statement that the Constitution itself, the federal Constitution, was ordained and established by the people of the United States for themselves, for their own government, but not for the government of those individual states. As in, when we wrote the federal Constitution, we meant to apply it to the federal government, not the states. And you can sort of see this because each state then created its own state constitution, providing for its own powers and limitations, just as the federal government's constitution does for the federal government. This separation was set up intentionally by the people that wrote the founding documents, and the court found that because of that, they could not then start applying one constitution to another sovereign. The Supreme Court then also took a look at the federal constitution itself, and some of this is going to be familiar if you've listened to some of my prior videos, things like the ex post facto clause, where the Supreme Court specifically said, hey, look, we made a particular provision against the states in that clause. So the federal constitution explicitly says that states may not have an ex post facto clause, and neither can the federal government. It also points out in the federal constitution that it's the federal government, not the individual states, that have the power and ability to do things like declare war, mint currency, engage in treaty negotiations. The federal constitution explicitly delineates those times that it is affecting the states, and as a result, where it doesn't then make that explicit statement, the presumption is that it's affecting the federal constitution only. And then one last little point that they looked at was that in the Constitutional Convention, when they were setting up the original founding federal constitution, there is a ton of discussion about limitations of power on the federal government. The first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, are just that. Those are protections against government power to avoid overreach at the federal level against individuals and the states. However, the Supreme Court did note that there's very little evidence of the reverse discussion happening. That is, limitations on the state to protect against overreach. And so then taking that totality, the Supreme Court found that there was no indication in the federal constitution itself that they intended to apply the terms of the Fifth Amendment to the states. And without that intention and that clear expression of power to do so, the Supreme Court said that you cannot apply the Fifth Amendment of the federal constitution against the states. And so the end result of this discussion is that the Supreme Court found, because there was no repugnancy, there was no conflict between the federal constitution and Maryland's actions, there was no case, they had no jurisdiction to hear it, and so they dismissed his claim outright. And so while the end result of this particular case is actually a technical dismissal with no specific judgment being levied against either side, the case is actually a full-scale discussion and affirmation of the concept of federalism in our system. So in the previous cases that I've discussed, I have talked often about having to incorporate a particular federal constitutional right to the states themselves to protect the citizens. The entire line of constitutional privacy cases that we've talked about was that concept. And the reason that they ended up needing to do it that way was Barron. This case set out the explicit rationale that there was a distinct separation between the federal constitution and the actions of the states. Without that incorporation, without that 14th Amendment that came after the Civil War, to bind the state and the federal constitution together, they were wholly separate. And you had to bring a state action with the state constitution if it was a state issue. So that was Barron v. the City of Baltimore. It's a fairly quick case, a fairly short case, but an interesting one nonetheless. So reach out below, let me know what you think. Was the court correct when they made the explicit point that the two sovereigns would end up creating two completely different schemes? And if so, was it a good thing? Or, as I've heard some people argue, do you think that the federal constitution supersedes the states and would always apply in the protection of the national civil interest? I'd love to know what you think. I'm actually kind of undecided, so arguments abound, let me know. And until we are back together again, I hope everyone is well.